Welcome to Around the Corner, a podcast about leadership and organizational performance. I'm Ayanna James.
And I'm Megan Liu. Welcome to Season 1, where we talk with 9 future-focused leaders and dig into their stories and perspective, as well as wisdom about driving change and leading into the future. At Strad, we believe that leadership is the engine of performance, and our work creates the pathways to make that possible.
Conversations like this podcast help shape our own work with leaders, and we are excited to share with you. Perhaps you'll be challenged or take away an insight that enriches your own leadership journey. Welcome to Around the Corner. In today's episode, we get to talk about leadership that shapes institutions at the very heart of our communities. Organizations whose work is less about profit and more about people, purpose, and the public good. In this episode, we step inside the United Church of Canada. Created by an Act of Parliament in 1925, this year marks the church's centennial as the country's only Christian denomination formed in that way. Over the past 100 years, the church has lived through extraordinary shifts. War and peace, social movements, and the ongoing transformation of what it means to belong, believe, and contribute to society.
Our guest, Reverend Dr. Michael Blair, serves as General Secretary of the United Church of Canada. He brings a rare perspective, holding together historical wisdom, the realities of today, and a posture of active hope for tomorrow. Today, the questions facing the church mirror questions facing many organizations. How does it remain relevant in the face of a changing landscape? How does it lead with resilience in the midst of decline, uncertainty, and complexity? And what is the role of hope when the future feels unknown? In this conversation, you'll hear about leadership that is rooted in values, tested in challenge, and alive to the possibility of a different future.
Wherever you may be in your relationship to concepts like spirituality or faith, this is a chance to glimpse a unique part of our social fabric and to reflect on what it means to lead in any purpose-driven context. Let's step into the conversation.
Michael, welcome. Thank you for taking time with us today.
Thank you.
As we kick off these podcasts, we always open with asking our guests for their definitions, their perspectives on 3 words: leadership, performance, and potential. So we'd love to invite you in, and I'm excited to hear your perspective on how you apply that in your context.
Thanks. I'm looking forward to this conversation. For me, leadership is about a particular skill set that enables the leader to be able to name vision, share vision, and invite others into that vision. It's about the ability to, I think, allow folks who work alongside the leader to develop their skills, to own their own capacity, but driven by the vision that is laid out. So the vision needs to be articulated. The vision needs to be painted in such a way that people can actually see what the outcome would look like. And it's about also the capacity to motivate people so that the folks who you are responsible to offer leadership with can feel motivated, and in that motivation also feel a sense of ownership. So they're carrying out the vision that's laid out, but they have, through the motivation and through conversation, own the vision as well. And so they're leaning into it in some specific ways. In terms of potential, I think in many ways, potential for me is similar to possibilities. So potential is about being able to help or support staff that reports to you as a leader, to be able to grow into their own capacities. So potential can be wishy-washy if it doesn't have any kind of framework around expectation. So it's important to lay out a sense of expectation, a sense of what's possible, and in doing that, to be able to provide some equipment or resources for the person to lean into that. Performance is, in some ways, for me, performance has to do with metrics as well. So that one, again, lays out clearly the expectation. And so that there is a kind of a measurement, so that as the individual lives into whatever their job role is, again, there's clear expectation, there's clear outcomes, there's stuff that's measurable. And so one's activities is measured against those outcomes and expectation. So those are kind of where my brain goes when I think about those three terms.
Lovely. Michael, because of the context that you're in, which is a deeply complex arena in the spiritual landscape, is there anything particular and unique about about leadership and applying everything you've just described within the spiritual, ecosystem, if you will, that you just want to highlight? I'd love for us to just if there's something really particular.
So I think partly some of it is going against kind of assumptions. So when I think about the life and ministry of Jesus in particular, from the very outset, Jesus was clear about what the kind of vision was, right? Luke chapter 4, Jesus articulates a clear kind of vision. And so he works with the disciples, and he kind of lives into and demonstrates to them how one lives into the vision. So I think in many ways we have been numbed in a kind of faith-based space to think that the principles of offering leadership, the principles around requiring metrics for performance, the principles of nurturing potential are secular, and yet it's very much embedded in our faith perspective. I think in some ways the additional component of kind of working in a faith environment is that it allows for what I would call grace. And so there are opportunities in the process to be able to offer folks a bit of a runway, and that failure is not the end. So failure doesn't become you fail and you're out, but failure becomes one of the platforms for continued learning. So I think the challenge is a mental one, I think, to reimagine that the requirements of leadership is equally valid in a faith-based, and it's not just a secular component.
Yeah, thank you for that, Michael. I sense that our conversation today will be a lot of exploration around the use of vocabulary
Yeah.
and language,
Yeah.
and what we authorize, right, as being valid language that creates the mental models and frames as to what good looks like. The architecture of grace, some and other vocabularies may say, yeah, that's about flexibility, adaptiveness, adaptability, the openness to have more room in the playground, right, of organizational possibility, knowing that that can create room for people to be unlocked and give their best selves. I'm a fan of all the languages. We are here at Strat, so welcome to use all the languages that resonate for you. Let's go back in order to look forward. So, Michael, it'd be lovely for you to locate us in your story, how you want to tell that story, from early beginnings, the call to ministry, the kind of work that you have done, landing in the role that you embody today.
I'm not quite sure where to start, but so I think for me, I go back to my high school experience. And in high school, I had a professor, a teacher, Sam Washington is the name. He's just recently deceased a couple of years ago. That Sam saw as part of his kind of Christian discipleship the importance of nurturing or mentoring students that came across his path. And so I can still remember the one story I remember particularly. I was just started high school, and I went to high school in Jamaica, and our our classrooms didn't necessarily all have walls, so you could look outside. And there was a huge tree in the yard. And I remember him saying to us, he said, if you aim for the top of the tree, you're going to land someplace down below. But if you aim for the sky, more than likely you will hit the top of the tree. And that for me was kind of a moment of kind of awakening to that, the question you asked earlier about potential. It was an awakening, and it was kind of a metaphor and imagination about aiming for the sky. Like if your goal is the top of the tree, then you have to aim higher in order to get to the top of the tree. And that's kind of been a kind of foundational principle for me in my life experience. With that, I think came the opportunity to be involved in a number of projects and study groups and that kind of stuff, and found myself in a position where I was able to offer insight in ways that was quite surprising to me, but in doing that was always affirmed in the capacities that I brought. And so I think that kind of laid a really good foundation for me, and the sense that other people affirmed what I brought to the experience, and that was a kind of helpful thing. I think fast forward to immigrating to Canada and having to kind of adjust to a new context and a new situation, deal with issues that I never had to deal with in the context of growing up in Jamaica, but also recognizing that my Jamaican experience, and particularly that kind of story of aiming for the sky, kind of shaped my imagination in some clear ways. So I came, I applied myself, I committed myself that I was going to achieve. And so my practice was aiming for the sky. And so as I aimed for the sky, and folks affirmed and saw um, charisms in me that were encouraged and given opportunity to kind of be brought out. In college, I remember becoming the president of the student body. And again, part of that was able to shape a vision of what the student body could achieve. And so that combination of aiming high, working hard, and folks affirming, and with that affirmation, opportunities came. Fast forward again in seminary, the same kind of pattern came into being. Graduated from seminary, my first pastoral charge, again, the affirmation of folks in that context, that it almost seems to that everything I kind of put my hand to was successful. And so part of that, again, was clarity in my own mind of what I needed to accomplish. Even today, there are folks from that experience almost 40 years ago that are still part of my life experience. And I see some of what I contributed continuing to be part of their life experience. And again, working hard, folks noticed, opportunities came. And that's kind of been the pattern of my life. Congregation, the first congregation I pastored was also the last congregation I pastored. There was a number of years in between. And when I went to that congregation, they asked me, so what's your biggest fear of becoming our minister? And I knew at the time the building was the issue. So I named that. Over the course of ministry there, decided that we needed to tackle the building and do a significant redevelopment. We hired a professional fundraiser, and the fundraiser said we needed to raise a certain amount of money from the congregation. And if we weren't able to raise that amount of money, the project wouldn't go. And so we proved them wrong. And part of that was my capacity to share the vision. And part of my particular role in that was to visit, share the vision, and allow other people to buy in. And before you know it, we raised way more than he thought we could. He suggested we needed to raise about over 700,000 from the congregation to make the project go. We raised close to $1 million, and we got the project off the ground. And today the building is still there, and had a significant shift in the life of the congregation. So I think after congregational ministry, I ended up as the executive director in Regent Park, and took over leadership of an organization where the founding executive director had served for 37 years. And so I was replacing him, and recognized in some ways that it's a hard shoes to fill when you had the founding director for 37 years. And so in some ways, had to find a path both to help renew the organization, but also lay a future. So I think after a number of things, one, building relationship with other executive directors in the community, working with the city to kind of understand the direction that was going on, and building relationships with the developer, because at the time Regent Park was slated for redevelopment. And all this while finding a vision for the organization for the future. So worked with a small group, kind of named a vision, painted the vision everywhere I went. I talked about it. Part of what we needed some monies. And after me talking about it for about 5 or 6 months, somebody called and offered us $2.5 million to kickstart the redevelopment. But completely through the vision, completely kind of realigned the organization, gave the organization kind of new purpose, brought some people in. So, for example, one of the things, Regent Park was being redeveloped, and I knew from my pastoral experience that when people had to move, it was a traumatic experience, and knew that for some of the older folks who lived in the community, that trauma could lead to death. And so hired a chaplain, a community chaplain, to work with folks in the community. And sure enough, within the first year of people being relocated from their homes, about 7 of the residents died. And so he had built enough relationship, so he was able to do community memorials. So they had services to kind of honor the folks who lived. Housing company, and the CEO of the housing company, I heard him say once that it's the first time in the history of redevelopment in an existing community where people had to relocate, where the relocation happened without any eviction. And he attributed that to the presence of the community chaplain, which was, again, something kind of seeing the challenges I had to raise money for that position. But that kind of helped to kind of frame some of the capacity to kind of offer leadership, the clarity of kind of vision to be able to see what others can see and to name it. And to also, I think, further to kind of look into the future and see what was coming down the pike. So in some ways, and again, I would say probably another aspect of leadership is to be able to anticipate the future and plan in the present for the future, and that was something that was able to do.
Michael,
Fast forward, go ahead.
just as you say that, you're saying some real gems along the way. That sense of, we like to put the word strategic in front of a lot of words, but that sense of strategic, holy, spirit-filled foresight that is deeply human, right? To be able to anticipate levels of required care, trauma, as
Yeah.
you name it, so crisply. Michael, how in it you're emphasizing the stewardship of vision, the articulation of it, the care of it. If that is a muscle that leaders need, what have you learned about developing that muscle? How do you get better at it in these leadership roles? How do you mature that?
That's a good question. And so in some ways, back to the earlier conversation about is there a difference in kind of a faith base? Um, Part of me would say that for me, it also feels like a spiritual gift, in the sense of uh, being able uh, to perceive. So it's a combination of being present and also bringing kind of information that you have. So, I did a degree in psychology. And so, in this particular context of the trauma of relocation, people had lived 30, 40 years in the same place. That was going to be a upheaval. So, is bringing those things together to say, in this particular context, how does those things come together? Um, the uh, One of the challenges, and somebody keeps asking me this question even in my particular job is, what problem are you trying to solve, right? And in many ways, we tend to be trying to solve problems of the past, not anticipate in the future, right? So we focus, and especially in the church context, we're dealing with issues that are yesterday's issues, and we're trying to solve them today. And what that does is that it doesn't enable us then to have the capacity to address tomorrow's challenges, which we need to set ourselves up today for tomorrow. So, I think part of it is if you use the language of muscle, I think part of it is bringing all that we have to the particular context in which we find ourselves, and to be able to kind of see a different kind of future or what's possible.
Michael, you're helping me perhaps like unpack a little about what might be meant when we invite people to be present, invite leaders to be present. Like that word I think is often used, but what does it really mean? I'm hearing in you two lovely points about that. So play back to me if I'm hearing you well. To be present is to um, be a thoughtful steward of what you give your attention to externally, right? Externally, what do you give your attention to? And it's also about what you are authorizing by way of the life that you have lived, authorizing as a valid input. So it's like both there's an input part and there's like an output, there's like an external and there's like a mining of the interior as well. Am I hearing you well?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah, I think that's really lovely. It's lovely and it's powerful. It means it's accessible to everyone because we all have a story, expertise, experiences, etc. that we can access, and hopefully teams and others that we can, leverage their wisdom and insights, expertise, and we all can be thoughtful, careful stewards of what we're paying attention to, what we're inviting into our orbit of decision making and observation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's critical, right? And then I think part of it too is then where do we find partners? So an example in Regent Park example, um, the developers who were given the development contract, um, I met with the CEO of the company, and I basically said to him, look, you're coming into people's homes. They don't trust you. You have to build the capacity to gain their trust. And you can't just treat them as objects. You have to learn about who they are, and challenged him to think about doing the redevelopment in a different kind of way. He became a critical ally as we moved forward. And even today, as Regent Park is continuing its redevelopment, he is a critical ally in the community. He talks about it. So a couple of years, he was a musician. And so a couple of years after this conversation that he and I had, he wrote a song and talked about what he'd learned out of the experience of the conversation with me, and sees that conversation as a kind of critical, pivotal change in perspective in terms of how he's worked in the community. And again, I think is looking for allies, but it's not a kind of a sucking up to allies, but actually being able to have frank conversation about the context in which we find ourselves, and invite people into a place of doing different or being different or approaching different. And certainly that's happened, right? And I think that's part of the leadership is also, I think, identifying where are the kind of critical partners, people who have the resources and the capacity that you don't have, but can contribute to if an effective outflow of what you want to see accomplished. So that's been a lesson for me in terms of my leadership.
I think it's so lovely. You're pouring into the vessel of, stakeholder management, stakeholder engagement, strategic partnerships, but you're pouring into that vessel of humanity. Like it's the straight talk that ultimately, whatever titles we bear, you're this community, you're this constituent, etc., and we gather at round tables or one-on-one. It's straight talk, human conversation that's actually happening. And so really appreciate that human level that you're bringing to it. Okay. Michael, tell us about leadership of a complex organization like the United Church. You are stewarding an organization that is 100 years old. It came into being through an act of parliament. No other Protestant denomination has done that except for the Church of England. This is not the Church of Canada. It is the United Church of Canada. So voluntarily, several denominations came together to make this happen. But it is through a corporate act of parliament, we came into being. So there's very particular governance about it. We have congregations across the country, coast to coast to coast. They're not franchised. They all stand with their own vision and mission and boards and trustees. So you are decentralized in many ways, and you have this centralized body, a spine called the General Counsel Office that supports leaders and congregations across the country. It's so complex. Let's start with the happy news. What's life-giving about stewarding and leading this kind of complex organization?
So I think probably too, the folks that I get to work with is at all levels of the church, the paid staff, volunteer staff, congregations. So I think there's something about that. And I think what's dreams is probably the ability to dream and try to see some of that dream take life is something that for me that's life-giving amidst the kind of complexity. So one of the things for me is drawing from, if I use the language, drawing from the well of our history in order to kind of find a pathway for our future. Authority versus influence is one of the complexity of the organization. That in some ways, at the level in which I sit, I have influence. I have very limited capacity for authority. So I can't make it so because the structures that are built in. And so, part of the complexity of our history is that we didn't trust each other. So we were able to come together across our differences. And I think that's one of the gifts of this denomination is that it's been able to to find something new across its diversity. But in order to get there, it built in a whole pile of checks and balances. And in some ways, those checks and balances today don't quite make sense, but they're so much a part of our life and our history that it becomes problematic, and it's a thing which kind of holds us back. So it's some of it is trying to get back to what was the intent, and how can we re-articulate the intent in order to find a path to the future. So for me, that kind of dismantling and re kind of developing is also part of the strands that is exciting. It's not always easy in terms of the complexity. And I would say one other thing about the challenge of kind of leading a complex organization like this is that one has to learn to live with the nuances and not with kind of this kind of duality or binary, right? Everything is nuanced. And so one has to have the capacity to live with nuance and make sense out of nuance. I
Yeah,
don't know if that makes sense.
it makes a lot of
Yeah.
lot of sense.
Yeah.
And just back on the capability topic of leaders, we see it in our work, don't we, Megan? The nuance and the skill of knowing what to access of the history of an organization, what to access of the history of a team, right? At like the smallest level within organizations, what to leave behind, what to pull forward that's actually right. I think a lot of leaders right now are very future focused. I mean, we use that language, future focused leadership, but it's not an abdication of what has come before. It is about the humility and maturity, as we see leaders practicing it well, about respect for, accountability for the past, but again, that discernment of what to bring forward and what to leave behind, in the story, in the vision setting, right? In the decision making.
Yeah. I think it's a place where the intent, right? So, when I think about the United Church, the intent was how can we have a significant part to play in the shaping of the development of Canada. That's part of the intent. We wanted to be involved in the shaping of kind of a vision for Canada. And in some ways, we've lived into that. whether it's early days of the ordination of women, way back in the 1960s, opening up ourselves to an understanding and appreciation of the diversity of religious expressions. So the seeds of working in interfaith context was part of our imagination in the 60s. Starting to work at decolonizing ourselves in terms of our global thing. So there are these moments that feeds the intent. And so when you say, okay, today, how do we apply that intent to the context in which we are? The context is different, but the intent, if we can understand the intent, then we can figure out, so how do we pull the intent from the past and still live into that intent? So how do we continue to be a church that there's a place at the table for all? How do we continue to ensure the kind of space of acceptance, belonging, freedom, honoring, all those, whatever language you want to use, in today's? And so, one of the challenge then is that we can't give up the landscape because those values are even more critical today, right? In a society, in a world where intolerance is so rife, having a space and a place of acceptance and well-being and wholeness for all is critical. And so, how do we ensure that our brand, to use that language, continues, because what our brand has to offer is important in the overall life of the world, not just Canada or the church.
Michael, I have a question on, perhaps as I hear you describe intent, vision, where you're headed, pulling from the past, reminding folks of the relevancy and the need for the here and now. For me, what comes up is the notion of trade-off. And perhaps it's just curiosity around, given your governance structure, given your need to lead through influence, how do you manage trade-off between what you can see and what's happening on the ground?
That's an interesting question. And, so I need to think about that kind of trade-off question, right?
Right.
Let me play with it, and then you can
Sure.
kind of parse it out. So one of the streams of our history is congregationalism. And so congregations tend to be more connected to themselves in a way than being part of a whole. Because, as we say, we're not franchises. Every congregation has its own independence. Left to their own devices, because they're so embedded locally. So, for example, if a congregation closes, their initial instinct is to spend the money locally, and they forget that they're part of a bigger whole that needs resources to ensure that the values that they appreciate continues, right? So I think part of it is trying to part of that trade-off is helping to paint the kind of bigger picture, right? So I mean, that's part of it. Like, this is who we are collectively. So it's about kind of rehearsing the kind of collective story, not just the individual story. And that's probably one of those places where trade-off needs to happen, right? So um, for me, it's acknowledging, yes, your local identity is critical, but your local identity, if you don't exist locally, then there's something that's lost collectively. And so it's trying to do the collective things. I'm not sure if that gets at the some of that trade-off. It's
Yeah, I think you're doing a beautiful job of what I'm not doing a good job describing, but this notion of oftentimes we're working with leaders and they're doing exactly what you're talking about in terms of painting a compelling vision, being able to remind folks of intent, and depending on their context and their location, there's a spectrum of authority and influence. And somewhere in there is perhaps this notion of nuance or trade-off of getting folks to remember the bigger context, the bigger intent, when there isn't direct authority there. And just acknowledging that is a different kind of leadership than having direct authority.
Yeah. And, it just reminds me of the critical piece around storytelling.
Yeah.
I remember some years ago when I was at Regent Park was part of a executive training program at one of the universities here in Toronto. And the first week of the training program, they brought in a professional storyteller to work with us. And it was like,
what are we doing?
I wouldn't
Yeah.
have necessarily associated storytelling with executive leadership. I have grown to appreciate how important it is, right? Because stories is one of the ways to help people see the vision.
Yeah.
Stories is one of the ways in order to help people live into the context of the nuances, right? And so that if you can tell stories and paint a picture, introduce people to what they can see, right? Because I think part of that leadership question is we can't see what we can't see. And so the leader has to help people see what they can't see and paint in some ways the alternative, right? I mean, when I think in terms of Jesus, I mean, it seems to me that's what Jesus did. As he was about his ministry, he was painting an um alternative thing, like the woman at the well. You're a man, I'm a woman, you're a Jew, I'm a Samaritan, neither the twain shall meet. And yet through the encounter, and as those of us from this angle who read this story, it paints this kind of picture of the possibility of human dignity, respect, valuing, in a way that works against kind of the normal society standards. And so again, that for me becomes another critical point of just kind of the stories help us to live in the nuances, and the stories help to paint that kind of alternative. But then helps people kind of figure out, so what's the trade-off? What am I willing to give up or let go of? Or where am I willing to say, I need help here. Can you help me? Because I can't, I mean, some days I wish I was a bishop. My bishop friends tell me that it's not as it cracks up to be, but in some ways you have to entice people into something and show them that it's possible, and stories help gets them there. Yeah.
Yeah, beautiful.
It's really helpful for those listening, Michael, who are leaders of volunteer-based organizations. I mean, this is the one-to-one comparison in many ways, right? Michael, we've talked about the importance of painting the vision. We've talked about mining the historical pieces, the blessings and the burdens there, and what to pull forward. Let's turn to, in the context that you are, which we've spoken of, let's turn to implementation and innovation. How do we now start to move to enacting upon said vision, spaces of innovation? What are you learning about now boots on the ground, doing a thing that actually is different? There are good news stories there, certainly. We'd love to probe around like the organizational, denominational doing of it. Like, the leadership levers that you're using in order to push implementation innovation forward?
Yeah. So I think one of the critical one, just given our structure, and it's something I learned from previous parts of the way in which we've lived, is to piloting, right? So in some ways, we uh, we ask for permission, which we've been granted, to experiment. So according to our structure, we need we need in some ways to suspend the rules of the game in order to kind of live into innovating, just because of the way it's structured. And so we went and we asked for permission to experiment. And so we're piloting. So I think we're investing in the experimentation. But a critical part of that investing is the harvesting of what we are learning. And so the idea is that we pilot, we invest in piloting, we harvest. And part of the harvesting is there part of the structures that need to change, right? Because we have this thing called a manual that governs our life together. And
All the
so,
roles, all the roles.
yes, as we're learning, is there stuff that we need to change? Um, what an interesting thing we're learning, particularly in this season where we're experimenting and innovating, and um, in a way, I would say we're we're innovating, but within limits. I don't think we have kind of gone as far as we can or we could. Um, uh, but what we're learning is that the perception around the rules are the challenge and not the rules themselves, because what we're discovering is that the rules has way more flexibility in it than we imagine, right? So people see the rules as you can't go there, but as we're experimenting and innovating, we're discovering that the rules aren't the problem. The problem for us is uh, uh, a lack of willingness to exercise autonomy, and a fear that is rooted in all kinds of stuff. I'm not sure we're clear. We just have this kind of, we're afraid, right? And there are a number of things we're afraid of. One, we're afraid of leadership. We have a system that actually fights against anybody actually offering leadership, right? So then the rules become a way of protect us from allowing anybody to lead. So that's one of the fears. The fear is we're going to go back to a time that was hurtful and painful. So, for instance, I think um, the the church's decision around its the welcoming the place of LGBTQ folks in the life of the church, that didn't come easily. There was a lot of pain, lots of hurt. Some of it continues. I think even though the church has recently apologized, we got a lot of work to do. And so folks are afraid that um, folks might come into the life of the church and pull us back. And so we're protecting to ensure that doesn't happen. We are theologically liberal, and so we want to protect that space. And so we become suspicious and fearful of folks who may articulate a different kind of theology than we are. So all these things get in the way. Those fears get in the way. And rather than articulating our fears, we lean into the rules. So as we innovate, or try to innovate and invest in innovation, we're recognizing that the rules aren't the problem. Other things are the problem. And now the challenge of leadership now is, how do we address the fears and the anxieties that folks have, and allow them to kind of let go and uh, create a new future, right? Um, so as we're learning, uh, the rules are there as kind of fence posts. They're not there as stop signs, but we use them as stop signs rather than fence post. Yeah.
Michael, perhaps a tactical question. You've done a beautiful job of, for many, articulating, the journey of change and being able to see through first objections, the rules don't work, and actually see to more of a root cause level around fear. How have you brought the fear forward? Is that you facilitating conversation? Is that you helping to see it and name it? What are the tactics? What are the ways in which you've helped folks see the difference between the rules and truly at a root cause level, the fears?
That's a good question. And I think in some ways we're still in the early stages, but I think part of it is kind of naming it. And so one of the ways in which I do that again is pull from our history. So there are two main reasons why the United Church, or actually three main reasons why the United Church came into being. One is the vastness of the country, right? The three denominations, who are predecessor denominations, saw how huge Canada was and recognized that they just didn't have the capacity individually to tackle the growth of Canada. One of the other issues that brought them together was lack of finances. So they were all struggling with finances. And so part of to kind of lift up that part of the story is to say that even today, as we struggle with finances, we can draw from what our predecessors did. So rather than kind of bemoan and give up, our predecessors were creative. So we're all struggling with finances. Let's do something collectively together. And this church was born. But the other challenge of from about 1908 to 2025, when union came into being, was the fact that there was a fear that European Catholics would dominate the Canadian landscape and take over have control over the political systems. And so we needed to build this bulwark of Protestantism to protect Canada from becoming Catholic. Well, that was a huge fear that caused us to do something. And in fact, the Catholics, so to kind of draw on the story of that history, to say we had this fear, but the fear wasn't the challenge, right? To help people think about that quietly, because sometimes the way our system works, as general secretary, one has to be careful what one says, but at the same time, you can use illustration, which I do when I preach. Use illustration to just kind of help to begin to sort of chip away at that fear. And again, this is where our history comes into being to kind of help us. So in 1972, we had our first Black moderator, and previous to that, when he was being ordained, the church was afraid that no congregation would hire him. So, and they were they were protective of him in some ways. So they didn't put his name out for settlement, and the church found a way to ordain him and settle him into ministry. Today, we have well over 100 Black ministers serving in the life of the church, and you have a Black general secretary, right? So some of the kind of social fear and anxieties, you kind of name that and say, like, the world hasn't ended. You had a Black moderator, the world didn't end. You now have a Black general secretary, the world isn't ending. In fact, we're in probably a more hopeful place than we have been in a long time, I would say. Um, Even coming out of COVID, I think there's a stronger sense of hope in our life together. And we have all these ministers across the country who are contributing significantly to the life of the church. So again, is kind of
Yeah.
telling the stories to help people kind of demystify the fears.
Yeah.
But it's important. I think it's important to understand what the real obstacles are to us being able to innovate, right? And some of it too is personal fears, right? I have to deal with my own personal fears as I offer leadership, and to ensure that my personal fears aren't getting in the way in terms of what's possible. So I think both institutionally and individually, one has to be attentive and to kind of demystify the fears, because in some ways the fears can haunt you and you do nothing, or you can understand where the fears are coming from and move the organization in a way that will be helpful.
Thank you. Yeah.
Michael, maybe our last organizationally focused question, and it's about pace. So, given all that you have said, and this is the root causes, is that it operates at a deep level, individually, collectively, right, denominationally. That can take time. So, you're leading an organization that needs to move at pace. There's urgency, the ambition of living our values expansively and demonstrating that coast to coast to coast is there. Say something about how how your leadership is supporting a sense of pace.
So two things I would say. One is, and this analogy doesn't quite fit because I don't know the game, but I see my role in some ways as kind of the person who allows, who provides a kind of defensive thing to allow the play to happen elsewhere on the field. So I think part of the pacing is to recognize that, yeah, there's some structural challenges, there's some fears, and there's some history. Or
Are you a
naysayers.
blocker? Is that what the position is? Like, are you a
Yeah,
blocker
and
so that the ball can advance on this side of the field?
yeah.
Okay.
I wish I knew the game, but I know there's an analogy there someplace. So that in some ways, part of the role is to create the momentum while dealing with the challenges. And so part of my role is to free others up and to protect their capacity to move us forward. And while part of me fights the old battles, right? So that in some ways they're not impacted by the battle, which I think it's an important part to play, right? In terms of enabling the organization. We're in an organization, and again, it probably comes back to that earlier question about what's the difference in the kind of leading a religious or spiritual organization. Again, we're in a space where sometimes our theology in some gets in the way, right? God's timing is not ours. And so we get into this sense of kind of, you know, why are you rushing to get stuff done? God will do what God will do in God's timing. And so I think there's a kind of a theological perspective or interpretation that in some ways can impact pacing. But the reality is that the world in our context is moving so fast that we can't sit around. It's back to that question. Part of our history is that our highest decision-making body met every 3 years. And if it made a decision and the decision had to go out to all the congregations to approve it, that's another 3 years. So we were in a situation where it takes 6 to 9 years to make a significant decision. Well, by the time the decision is made, it's irrelevant because the world's in a whole different kind of space. And so I think the tension for me of leadership is creating, I think one of the language I may use, create these learning labs that moves us into the future and make sure there's enough space, make sure there's resources, make sure it's supported, and at the same time, just trying to hold back the flood. And so you kind of have to live. I mean, part of the nuance is living in this space of you can't crash and burn the system as it is. So you have to be attentive to it and help it. But at the same time, you have to be creating a space where the new can come. And one of the things in this organization is that people have short memories. They sometimes think that they have long memories, but when the new thing happens and it becomes normalized, people think it was
We always
ever
do it this
thus,
way.
and they forget. Right? So I think again that's part of the nuance, right? Because the fear of the unknown is huge. But if you can create that space where new things can happen and the world isn't ending, and you find ways to normalize that new thing, then I think it gives people an opportunity to say, that wasn't as bad as I thought, right?
It's a
So
masterclass in change, theory to application in many ways. And the religious communities, the church included and beyond, so much of the ancient ever new stories are about personal stories of change. Personal stories of change. I was this way, now I'm this way. I knew this, now I know a different thing.
yeah.
Michael, thank you. The last frame of question, Megan and I would love to anchor or leave with, is about what you see around the corner in terms of leadership holistically. So if you were speaking to, as you often do, traveling this country and globally, emerging leaders, those who are entering into complex justice making, change making organizations. They're doing that out of values. They're doing that out of principles, out of love for themselves, for others, for the planet. What are the words of encouragement? What do you want them to hear, pay attention to, be buoyed up by?
A new world is possible. I think it is probably a fundamental thing, and that so that's one thing. New world's possible, and secondly, it's worth the price. Right. I mean, the offering leadership today in the context of a world that is changing at the rate in which the world's changing, and trying to ensure that one's attentive to all the the challenges and attentive to the fact of people, right? Because we lead institutions, but institutions are people, right? And we ought not to lose sight of that. And that to understand that it's worth it, that the struggle to create something new and to be responsive is worth it. Um, so yeah, the new world's possible. It's worth it. And I think the third thing I would say is don't do it alone. That it's critical. I'll use a language that you and I use, Ayana. It's critical to have conversational partners. It's critical to find people who can help you think, imagine, sharpen, sharpen your ideas, who can help you pivot in the way you need to pivot. And so whatever you do, don't go alone. And I guess the fourth thing I would say is invest in resources like, mentors. So, I mean, the conversational partner is one piece, but also to have a mentor, somebody who you invest in and they invest in you to help you kind of um, keep to the path, and to use the United Church language, you're not alone, right? Somebody who can help you um, gain perspective, somebody, articulation, uh, where we started earlier, language is important, that can put language to your ideation, can help you frame what's the next step. So those are a couple of things, I would say and I would say is that all the tools that you can have to help you imagine a future and dream the future, employ, so.
Lovely.
Aim for
Okay.
the sky.
Yeah.
Aim for the sky.
Yeah. Still,
Beautiful.
I can still see that tree. The next time I go to Jamaica, I have to go back up and see if the tree is still there.
That's really lovely.
Yeah.
Michael, we are deeply appreciative of your storytelling gift and your willingness to impart wisdom and to think aloud with us. We know it's a good conversation when we have to take a beat and our guests have to think about the question. So that's lovely. Conversation partners in action.
Yeah.
And thank you for the expansiveness of your leadership and the complexity that you steward, a very unique and dynamic space, and for the freshness that you bring to the table in being able to steward multiple dimensions, the past, the present, the future. And we're grateful for you and for what all those who are living into values that you named, like belonging and inclusion and freedom. Those things matter today more than ever.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Megan.
Yeah, it was lovely. Thank you. That was spectacular.
It was.
I got to be part of what felt like two colleagues, two friends, two thought partners together. So it was just amazing to, Ayana, see into a huge part of your life and to get to meet someone that I know you work so closely with. So thank you for that. I feel like I learned lots along the way. What struck me was perhaps the depth of that conversation and potentially the ability to arm listeners with lenses in which to re-listen multiple times, to be able to pull out so many of the tidbits, frameworks, tools, ways of thinking. So I thought we could maybe provide the lenses, and that might be the best way to kind of debrief that conversation.
Yeah, that's lovely. Yeah, Michael is a storyteller extraordinaire.
Mhm.
And as with good stories and good storytellers, there are multiple levels. And I like
Mhm.
your language levels, layers, and lenses through which to come back to the story.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
that conversation was really a powerful story. One lens
Mhm.
to kick off, I think, is the lens of leadership holistically.
Mhm.
So the expansiveness, the breadth, the aspirational aspect of it. In listening to the Reverend Doctor, you really get a sense of this is for the sake of the world, and our leadership can be expressed within location and locally. And it is inextricably tied to some really big ambitions. And so, you sit back and you lean in, sit back like, oh, like, yes, leadership can make this kind of impact. And you lean in because I want to be a part of that. Right. I really felt that in his conversation. And that because of that expansiveness, we can all find a place to hook into it. There's room. There's room for all of us at whatever level or moment in time that we are living out our own gifts of leadership. Um, you and I probably really delighted too in the lens of change, change management, stewarding change, uh, in adjacent to around complexity and lots of diversity. He kind of gave us a little bit of a toolkit, right? There's that- there's method to the madness.
Mhm.
Just to kick us off, definitely in supporting change, this notion of try a thing, experiment,
Mhm.
prototype, but do that with an attitude and a readiness to learn from what you've done. Don't just try, but try. Say, do a thing, then reflect on it. Some lessons learned. Um, Storytelling was another tool. What's one that you heard? Yeah.
I would say the other piece that was so helpful was getting the individual to see themselves in the collective and
Mhm.
vice versa.
Nice.
And so as he was, going about sharing examples of folks feeling like they couldn't do something or they haven't been there before, he was using storytelling as a way to remind the individual that the collective has done it before or the collective has expressed itself
Yeah.
in a new state differently.
Yeah.
Just to remind someone to connect someone to the bigger picture. I thought that was really a really powerful tool.
Mhm. The last thing maybe in the tool set of change, was the humanity he brought to, root causes of deep fear. And,
Yeah.
maybe it's the pastor in him, the pastor meet executive that it's humans who are going through change,
Yeah.
and therefore we carry our own, personal biases, resistance points, etcetera, and those are to be named, but
Mhm.
and also addressed with care and attunement, like a
Mhm.
sensitivity to that.
Yep.
But Michael also didn't stop there. It's like we've got to name it, and we need to also innovate, experiment, pilot.
Mhm.
And so his positioning of his leadership role of creating momentum for those who are further along in that journey,
Yeah.
while supporting those who are still in process in many ways,
Mhm.
very sophisticated landscape, as a
Mhm.
as a leader that he's navigating. But whenever
Mhm.
there's change, we're going to have people at different phases of
Mhm.
the journey, and so our leadership calls for that adaptability along the way.
Mhm.
So I really appreciated that change lens.
Yep.
There was a lens. I wish I counted how many times, but the lens of imagination making,
Mhm.
and maybe
Mhm.
connected to lens number one on leadership, uh, the 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 power, the beauty, in supporting the buy-in of people on their own change journey to find it, to get in touch with what the possibility is, what the
Mhm.
potential is, what could be around the corner. You can sense the sparkle in his voice and his eyes around what that can do for a people's, um,
Mhm.
any organization, community, institution.
Mhm.
If we can have a culture
Mhm.
that nurtures that, I think you use that verb, that nurtures
Mhm.
a sense of imagination is what we do and who we are.
Mhm. Mhm.
How much
Mhm.
possibility is unlocked there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he reframed potential as possibility.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. How might we? Really
Mm-hmm.
lovely.
Mm-hmm.
And then I just want to build on your point around the individual and collective.
Mm-hmm.
Michael also gave us a lens of individual and personal development as a
Mm-hmm.
leader.
Yeah.
As a leader, from the tree back in Jamaica and the teacher who, encouraged him to reach for the stars and land somewhere on the tree. I heard 3 A's, if you will. So
Mm-hmm.
A for the stars, right? Have a sense of what that ambition is. And it's great to have that sense of ambition. Go for it.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
then through his journey, he talked about aiming again, and then applying himself.
Mm-hmm.
What's the application of self, of smarts, of charisms? Gifts was a word that he used.
Yeah.
How do you apply that in various contexts and learn with others? And then the third A, what was the third A? The third was of affirmation, to
Mm-hmm.
pay attention for the voices who are um, encouraging you, affirming
Mm-hmm.
what you're doing, who are seeing you and beholding you. Trust those voices, test those voices. And he had a lovely little recipe around that he went through that loop over and over again and continues to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Aiming, applying, and listening for those sources of affirmation.
Mm-hmm.
So lots of richness, lots of lens to look at it. Whether our listeners are in not-for-profit settings, volunteer-based organizations, whether they're in corporate settings, I think there's something in here through these lenses that can be applied and taken away.
Agreed.
Thanks,
Wonderful.
Megan.
Thanks.
Thank you for joining us on Around the Corner, where history, hope, and foresight meet to shape the future of leadership. If you found today's conversation meaningful, please follow the podcast and share it with others who are curious about the future of leadership and performance.